Hi, my name is Steve Bartlett and welcome to Fight Back, my weekly show where I try to expose the world to things that are bothering me and encourage people to fight back against the injustices that exist in the law and in politics and anything else I can think of. I haven't been here for the last 3 weeks. I had a trial, a big criminal case, and just been really busy, trying to fight the man. It gets kind of tiring, but I decided to make it this week so I can talk to you guys. Now, today is a big day for me. And I'll tell you why. The reason is the Tampa Bay Lightning are playing the Washington Capitals, who are the defending champions, playing in Washington tonight with a big game. And I really want to be watching that game, which starts in 30 minutes. But instead, I'm going to be here with you, so I definitely will be missing the first period. On my way home tonight, I'll be listening to the game on the radio and hoping that they don't score so I don't miss anything good, but go Bolts, okay? But it means a lot that I care about a lot of issues and a lot of things that our society needs fixing, so that's why I'm here. I'm just trying to help the cause. I'm not getting paid anything. I don't have any agenda. I just want to express my opinion in ways that other people don't really express. Now, every week when I come on the show, I always have my little plan about what I'm going to do, and people don't probably understand that this show is done live. There's no edits, there's no script, I'm not reading off of a teleprompter. I have a couple notes here on my iPad, and that's it. There's no dress rehearsal, there's no producer telling me what to say next or anything like that. So what happens is I come here and I just guesstimate what I'm going to talk about and how long it's going to take me to talk about it. And I normally start rambling for a while, and then I get a little message that I got 5 minutes left, because then the show's going to be over, and then I have a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to finish talking about, so I start speeding up and I talk really fast like I'm all coked up or something, even though I'm not. But what happens is I tend to go really fast towards the end because I'm running out of time because I want to get everything in. So what I want to talk to you about tonight, I'm not going to limit myself. I'm not going to try to hurry up and get it all finished. If I don't get to all my notes, what I'll do is I'll just continue next week. I'll just finish what I have to say, my train of thought next week. So I'm going to try my best not to ramble, not to talk 90 miles an hour like I'm all, taking too much caffeine, okay? So what I want to talk to you about is something a little bit different. I know a lot of shows, what they do is they read the headlines and they just copy everybody else's shows. I watch MSNBC, of course, and, what happens on Chris Matthews, Rachel Maddow talks about the exact same things, an hour later. And then Chris O'Donnell talks about the same things 2 hours after that. I'm not reading the headlines and just picking the flavor of the month. I like to think of things myself, have my own spin on things as opposed to just parroting what other people are saying. And the one thing I really want to talk to you about is about conservatism and liberalism, because there's so much partisan fighting right now. There's so much tribalism going on right now that people are picking teams without even understanding or questioning why they're on the specific team that they're actually in. Okay? As everyone knows, there's the left wing, there's the right wing. There's liberals, there's conservatives, there's Democrat, and there are Republicans. And everybody thinks that they're all basically the same thing, that if you're a liberal, that means you're a Democrat. If you're conservative, that means you're a Republican. And even though that's pretty much true the way it is now, that's not the way it always used to be. A person isn't defined, their ideology should not really define a person's party, because for most of the history of America, there were both liberals and conservatives in the Democratic Party, and there were liberals and conservatives in the Republican Party. What a Democrat is today is not what a Democrat was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And the same can be said about the Republican Party. Because what happens is things change, people change, and ideology changes. Okay, so even though today the Democratic Party is the liberal party for the most part, and the Republicans are the conservative party, people really tend to get their ideology based upon their party allegiance as opposed to deep reflective thinking, and I think that's a problem. Let me explain. Years ago, I just assumed that people chose the political party that they wanted to be part of based upon whether that party matched their ideology. So in other words, if you were pro-choice and really didn't like that many guns being on the street, and those were some of the views that you had, you wanted to raise taxes on the rich, you would say, okay, I'll join the Democrats because they seem to be closer to what I believe in. Or if you were pro-life and wanted to keep taxes low and were a gun enthusiast, people would say, oh, I'll join the Republican Party because that's what they're actually for. But it seems to be as if people choose their team first, that they decide to become a Democrat first or a Republican first, and then get their ideology based upon whatever that team has as part of their dogma. So that you become a Democrat first, and then you say, oh, I'm a Democrat. That means I have to be pro-choice, I have to be pro-climate change, I have to be against guns. And then if you're conservative, oh, I got to be against taxes, I want to protect gun rights, et cetera, because I'm a conservative, and conservatives believe this way because that's the team that I joined up on. And what's weird is that even when parties, which this actually happens, change their positions and actually change their viewpoint on something. For instance, 10 years ago, Republicans were for free trade and hated the whole idea of protectionism. They wanted the free hand of the market to decide and were against tariffs. However, when Trump became president, the Republican Party, their members are on Team Trump and they are against free trade now, which is completely opposite from what Republicans used to believe in, which makes you think, is their ideology changing, or is their team loyalty so strong that if the team decides to change its ideology, its members changes the ideology as well? And I think that's really a fascinating thing. And one reason, or one proof of that, is the concept of climate change, for instance. Climate change should not really be a controversial issue. It's based upon science. And I can understand a conservative attack for climate change saying we can't afford to pay for the technology in order to try to save the environment because we're fiscally conservatives and financially it could hurt our economy. I understand that idea. That's consistent with conservative values. But when the majority of Republicans say that the science is bad and they don't trust the science, science should not be something that's political. And yet it is. Why do the majority of Republicans doubt that the science of climate change is real, when the vast majority of Democrats believe that it's completely real? Why do the teams always line up? And the other thing is, how does one thing affect another? In other words, if a person is pro-gun, the odds are that they believe that climate change is a hoax, even though the two issues are completely separate. Climate change has nothing to do with guns. And if you are pro-gun, the majority of people who are pro-guns are also pro-life and are against abortion, even though those two issues have nothing to do with each other. Why does it line up that way? To me, it seems like the reason it lines up that way is because that's what your party says, and people follow the rules. Once you join your team, once you pledge your fraternity, you accept all the dogma and whatever rules your party says. Years ago, Republicans were for wanting to make it easier for immigrants to come to our country. Okay, and that's what most Republicans are for. Now that we have Trump as president, the party line has changed, and now not only is Trump for reducing the amount of immigrants that come into our country, but that's what the Republican Party believes, and most of the members of the Republican Party believes it as well. So the question is, are people really free-thinking, or do they just believe what their party tells them to believe? Do they really choose their party based upon their ideology, or do they choose their party first and then adopt their ideology based upon what team they actually chose to join? But I'm going off on a tangent right now because that's not what I really wanted to talk to you about. What I wanted to talk to you about was liberalism and conservatism and what these actually mean historically, because a lot of people call themselves conservatives and they really don't understand what a conservative actually is. And if you ask them, well, why are you a conservative? They can't really tell you. Same with a liberal. Okay, I'm not saying that one's better than the other. Both sides do this. People don't really understand the history of their own ideology, and I want to talk to you about that. Now, some people are misguided, and they define things based upon how they want to define them. I got a good friend who watches this show regularly, and we fight on Facebook all the time. I'll say her name, Becca Roney. If you're watching, I just threw it out for you. And we argue over everything. But her position is, when you define conservative and liberal, basically, if she agrees with something, she calls it conservative. If she disagrees with something, she calls it liberal. And it doesn't matter what it actually is. You know, if it's good, it's conservative. If it's bad, it's liberal. If it's evil, it's liberal. God's a conservative. Satan is a liberal. I mean, that's the way she actually sees it. Totalitarianism is liberal in her view. Freedom is conservative. Now, that's not based upon any historical evidence of what conservatism or liberalism actually is. That's just her own personal way of doing it. A lot of people seem to be that way. They feel that if they like it and they've already labeled themselves as being something, then whatever they label it as is positive if that's what they agree with. And that's really not the way it's supposed to be, and that's not how it works historically. Now, it is hard to define what an actual liberal is and what actually a conservative is, because these terms have changed historically. What it meant to be a conservative 100 years ago is different from what it means to be a conservative 50 years ago or even 10 years ago. The same with being a liberal. But let's talk about the terms liberal, because I've always used the term liberal. That's what I grew up calling myself a liberal. And most liberals no longer call themselves liberals because in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan did a fantastic smear campaign so that anything that was liberal was considered to be bad. So liberals were afraid to call themselves liberals because as soon as you were given that label, you were considered to be a bad, horrible person or whatnot. So liberals started calling themselves progressives. Okay, so most people who are Democrats running for president, you never hear of them say, I'm a fighting liberal. They say, I'm a fighting progressive. And actually, that's probably, even though I still call myself a liberal, progressive is probably a more accurate term, especially due to the fact that the word liberal has dramatically changed its meaning over the last couple hundreds of years. So what a liberal actually meant back in the 17th century is completely opposite to what a liberal means today. In fact, liberalism was dealing with an economic philosophy back then, which conservatives today embrace. Conservatives today embrace 17th century liberalism, which is really difficult. And because of that, it's probably better to use the word conservative and progressive, especially since you can pretty much figure out what a conservative is and what a progressive is by the actual word itself, because when you hear the word conservative, you hear the word conserve. When you hear progressive, you hear the word progress. And that is basically, no matter how much policies may change, the basic idea of conserving and progressing are pretty much are the defining characteristics of a liberal and a conservative. Liberalism and conservatism, or progressivism and conservatism, that precedes American history. I'm not talking about the last 50 years, 100 years, or even 200 years. There has been conservatism and there has been progressivism throughout all of human history. And it's not, you know, like I said, people tend to define things based upon the here and now, but that's not exactly the historical trend. For instance, conservatives like to say that conservatives are for capitalism, while progressives are against capitalism and are for socialism. But the truth is, conservatism and progressivism, they're actually older than the concept of socialism. Socialism only came up as a concept in the 19th century. But both conservatism and progressivism existed long before socialism. They're both older than capitalism. Capitalism only started developing around the 17th century as well. It's not a really old thing. But so conservatives existed before there was capitalism. So you can't say the defining characteristic of a conservative is their support of capitalism any more than you can say that the definition of a liberal or progressive is somebody who embraces socialism, because both of those concepts are a lot older than these economic philosophies. So what actually is conservatism? What conservatism is based upon is conserving tradition, conserving the structure that are important, conserving tradition, okay? Conservatives like to look to the past. You know, we have gotten here. We've become great as a country, not due to luck, but because we've had great traditions. Traditionalism is another word that's very similar to conservatism, okay? Conservatives believe in stability. They believe that social structures of the past are strong, and that's what provides security. They believe in concepts of these social structures such as family, values such as country, hard work, traditional values. That's what conservatism is about. Preserving what we have now, out of a fear of the unknown, out of a fear of something changing. Why change and do something different when what's currently working, what we're currently doing is currently working? Why risk everything by doing something radically different? That's what conservatism is actually about. This idea of rejecting change. Okay? That's one reason why conservatives don't like the idea of socialism now. Why change it? Capitalism has done great things for America. Why make the change? The whole idea of gay marriage was something that conservatives were totally fearful of. Why change the basic social structure of the family, which is the building block of our American culture? Why risk that by allowing gay marriage? The whole idea of fear of immigrants, changing the complexion of our country and the culture of our country, and the fear of having people speaking many languages when we've historically been a country that speaks English. These are things that conservatives do not like because it challenges the basic social structure of our country, and they want to preserve this tradition. They want to preserve these values that they've gotten used to and have actually helped make America become great. It's this nostalgic for the past, okay? Now, even though I call myself a big liberal, you know, one thing that I'm not liberal on or progressive on is the concept of baseball. I've been a huge baseball fan, but I am the most conservative baseball fan ever. I hate the designated hitter. I hate interleague play where the American League plays the National League in games. I used to love it when you would never see these players except for the World Series. It was so unique, or in the All-Star game. But when you get to play them during the regular season, that whole difference between the American League and the National League mean nothing. And I can't stand the concept of a wild card being able to play in the playoffs. The best team should be playing in the World Series, not some third-place team that snuck in with a wild card. Greatness is defined over 162 games, not winning some lucky series because you got a hot pitcher. So when it comes to baseball, I am extremely conservative because I like the tradition of baseball, going from the 19th century into the dead ball era of Honus Wagner and Ty Cobb, and then Babe Ruth in the 30s and the 20s, and then Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, and all the way up to today. You know, that historical past, the tie to the past makes baseball is such a wonderful game that fathers can talk to their sons, and you can talk to your grandfather about great baseball players. So you can argue with your dad about who's the best center fielder of all time, or your grandfather. Was it Mickey Mantle, the greatest center fielder of all time? Or your great-grandfather? No, it was Joe DiMaggio. Or your great-great-grandfather who says, no, it was Tris Speaker or Ty Cobb. Okay? I understand why people like conservatism, because they like that connection to the past. I'm not condemning it. I don't agree with it, that's not how I am, but my love of baseball and baseball tradition gives me some sort of insight as to why people embrace the concept politically of conservatism. Now, and they like the idea of strength because that's a conservative value as well. They like stability, so having a strong military, being for pro-law enforcement, maintaining law and order, helps maintain that status quo, maintaining that tradition and those values that are important to conservatives. Liberals and progressives on the other hand, they're for the concept of change. They like the idea of looking to the future instead of looking to the past. What can we do differently? Yes, we might like how it's working now, but it can be better. Let's try something different. Let's go into the new horizon. Let's try a different approach. You know, the whole idea of like a capitalistic society. Yes, capitalism works, but we can make it better. We can make it more fair for people. We can make it more equitable. You know, always trying to change things. So look at history as moving in a certain direction, that goals are going to be accomplished. You know, our country used to be an extremely racist country back in the 18th century. And then we fought a war. And now in the 20th century, we got rid of Jim Crow laws and we created the Civil Rights Act. And now we even had an African American become president of the United States. That we're on this historical trend that we're moving forward as a country, that we're making progress. That's where progressivism comes from. And that's a big difference between what liberalism believes and what progressives believes versus what conservatives believe. We're looking forward as opposed to looking behind us. Right now, I'm not trying to place criticism as to what side is right or wrong. Even though I happen to be a liberal progressive, I can understand why people prefer tradition, prefer not to take chances and to do anything more radical or anything like that. But, you know, like I said, it's been going on for thousands of years, this whole idea of being conservative versus being progressive. You know, if you go back to the dawn of civilization, back when we were living in caves, back when we were hunters and gatherers, it was the conservatives who were saying, let's stay in the caves. Why change it? We have food, we have safety, we're not getting hunted by any animals. It's working right now, we're feeding our family. Why make a change? It was the liberals back then saying, let's try something different. Let's get out of the caves. Let's stop being hunters and gatherers, and let's try this farming thing that we came up with this idea of. And I'm sure they fought back then like they fight today, the difference between doing something different and taking a chance and maintaining stability by making things the way they actually were. Now, there's another term which is affiliated with conservatism, which is called reactionaryism, or being a reactionary, okay? Now, this is kind of an unusual thing. What happens if change occurs and then you start living in this new society? Does a conservative adapt to that change and then wants to preserve these new values that become embedded in society? For instance, let's look at Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade came out in the early 70s and became the law of the land and was highly controversial because it changed things. It created a new fundamental right to the Constitution that never existed before. And conservatives were outraged by this whole idea of the Supreme Court creating a new constitutional right. Okay? However, there's a concept in the law called stare decisis, which means respect for precedent, which is a very conservative idea, that once the courts establish a legal principle or an idea, the longer that stays the law of the land, the more respect you have to give that law, and you have to follow that tradition. It's called precedent. Okay? So for the last 40 years, Roe v. Wade has been the law of the land. So the question is, since we've relied on this law for the last 40 years, would a conservative be for Roe v. Wade or against Roe v. Wade? Okay? Because what does a traditionalist want to do? The status quo is that it's the law of the land. It would be radical to change that. Well, under the concept of being a reactionary would say that if the law changes and it creates a new social concept that you don't like, you want to get rid of that and go back to the way it used to be. So a reactionary conservative would say, forget relying on precedent, forget the whole idea of maintaining the social structure that exists right now. We want to undo the clock and go back to the way it used to be. Okay, we do want to still preserve tradition, but we think that this new tradition is against the old tradition that we want to go back to. So a reactionary is for change, but they want to change and set back the clocks to go back to the way it used to actually be, as opposed to going forward. And that's a more extreme version of conservatism, and there's some other cultures besides our culture which embrace a really reactionary type of conservative value. One would be fundamental Islam. The people who live in the Middle East who don't like the changes that occurred in the 20th century and think that it's an affront to Allah, so they want to go back and turn back the clock and go back to the way that they think Islam should be before all the reforms occurred, and wind back the clock 1,000 years. And that's why you have these Islamic fundamentalists who believe in a literal crazy version of Islam that more modern thinking Muslims don't agree with. Another thing that believes in an extreme reactionary version of conservatism, but not violent at all, are the Amish. The Amish don't like modern technology, so they want to go back to a more simpler time and wind back the clock to the way things actually used to be. Okay? But that is basically, in a nutshell, the difference between conservatism and progressivism, that one is looking forward and the other is trying to preserve what we already have. And Americans have been arguing over what that actually means and have been trying to do two things simultaneously: preserve what we have while moving to the future. So American culture has politically embraced both simultaneously conservatism and liberalism at the same time. And what we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks on the show is going back historically to see how did that actually exist before we became a country. What were the concepts of conservatism and liberalism that existed in England, which we inherited their economics, we inherited a lot of their legal ideas, and that's what our building blocks are. So if we can really understand American conservatism and American progressivism, we have to look back to England first. So the upcoming weeks, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about how the Democratic Party and the Republican parties developed under these concepts of liberalism and conservatism. So I'm really glad that you're taking the time and listening to this, to listen to me talk about this, because I think it's really important for people to really understand why they feel the way they do and why they believe they do, instead of just jumping on the bandwagon because that's what their team wants. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you to go home, watch the hockey game, watch the Lightning beat the Capitals in Washington, hopefully, and I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot. Bye.